This is a real event in the archives of human history. There are moments that defy simple explanation. Events so powerful and strange they seem to tear a hole in the fabric of accepted reality. They leave behind not answers, but a landscape of chilling questions. None is more profound, more violent, or more enduringly mysterious than the cataclysm that befell a remote stretch of Siberian forest on the final morning of June 1908. It was an explosion of such magnitude that it remains the largest impact event in recorded history. Yet it left behind a baffling absence of evidence, a silent, sprawling graveyard of trees that points to a mystery far deeper than a simple rock falling from the sky. The day was June 30th, in the vast, sparsely populated taiga of eastern Siberia. Near the Podkamenia Tunguska River, the sun rose into a clear summer sky. The local Evenki people, nomadic reindeer herders who knew the deep forest as their home, went about their morning rituals. Russian settlers in the few scattered trading posts and villages prepared for the day's labor. The world was quiet, insulated by millions of acres of pine, birch, and larch. At approximately 7:17 a.m. local time, that peace was annihilated. Without warning, the sky was split open by a column of light, described by witnesses as brighter and hotter than the sun itself. A cylindrical object, or perhaps a blindingly brilliant sphere, blazed across the atmosphere on a northwesterly trajectory, trailing smoke and fire. It was not a fleeting meteor, but a terrifying, prolonged presence, visible for minutes as it descended. For those on the ground directly beneath its path, the experience was apocalyptic. The heat was so intense that it set clothing on fire and scorched the skin of people dozens of kilometers from the eventual blast zone. A farmer named as Semena, sitting on the porch of his home in the trading post of Vanavara, some 65 kilometers to the south, saw the sky divide in two. The northern half was consumed by fire. He was thrown from his chair by a wave of searing heat. Feeling as though his shirt was burning on his back, he blacked out. When he awoke, the world was shaking, and a deafening sound, a continuous peal of thunderous artillery, rolled over him, shattering the windows of his home and shaking the very earth beneath his feet. Hundreds of kilometers away, the spectacle was no less terrifying. Passengers on the Trans-Siberian Railway watched in stunned silence as the fiery object streaked across the sky. The engineer of one train, fearing the tracks ahead were compromised by the tremors that followed, brought the locomotive to a screeching halt. In towns over 500 kilometers from the epicenter, a thunderous boom was heard. Windows rattled violently, and objects were knocked from shelves. The seismic shockwave was registered by observatories across Eurasia, from Irkutsk to Jena, Germany. An atmospheric pressure wave, a ripple of pure force, was so powerful that it circled the globe twice. Detected by sensitive barographs as far away as Great Britain and even Washington, D.C. For several nights following the event, the sky over Asia and Europe glowed with an eerie, silvery luminescence. The nights were so bright in London that one could read a newspaper outdoors at midnight. It was as if the very air had been charged with an unearthly energy. Yet, in the immediate aftermath, the world at large remained ignorant. The region was one of the most inaccessible on Earth, and the Russian Empire was already teetering on the brink of war and revolution. The stories of frightened peasants and indigenous tribesmen were dismissed as local superstition. The event, for all its awesome power, was swallowed by the silence of the Siberian wilderness and the noise of human conflict. It would be nearly 2 decades before the world would begin to understand the true scale of what had happened. The first person to truly confront the mystery was a Russian mineralogist named Leonid Kulik. Fascinated by meteorites, Kulik became obsessed with the scattered accounts of the 1908 event. He suspected that a gigantic iron meteorite had struck the Earth and was determined to find it. Securing funding from the Soviet Academy of Sciences, he launched his first reconnaissance expedition in 1921. But it wasn't until 1927 that he finally reached the desolate region described in the eyewitness reports. The journey was an ordeal, a brutal trek through swamps and dense, uncharted forest. Guided by reluctant Evenki hunters who held the area in superstitious dread. They called it the Vaya Yuli, the Valley of Fire, and believed it was cursed. Patrolled by the vengeful fire god Okti, who had smote the forest and would strike down any who trespassed. Kulik and his team dismissed the legends as folklore. Their scientific minds focused on the prize, a massive impact crater and the priceless meteoritic iron it would contain. As they drew closer to the coordinates calculated from eyewitness sightings, they began to see the first signs of devastation. The forest thinned, replaced by scorched and withered trees. Then, cresting a ridge, they were met with a sight that stopped them in their tracks. A scene of such utter and unnatural destruction that it defied all expectation. Before them, stretching to the horizon, lay a flattened wasteland. Over 2,150 square kilometers of forest, an area larger than modern Tokyo, had been obliterated. An estimated 80 million trees were felled, lying in a vast, radial pattern, their trunks all pointing away from a central point. It was a silent, wooden testament to a blast of unimaginable force. The power required to do this was later estimated to be between 10 and 15 megatons of TNT, roughly 1,000 tons more powerful than the atomic bomb dropped on Hiroshima. Kulik was awestruck, convinced he stood at the edge of the world's largest meteorite crater. He pushed his team onward into the heart of the blast zone, the epicenter of the destruction. But as they advanced, the scene grew stranger. The pattern of fallen trees was not perfectly circular, but shaped more like a giant, bizarre butterfly, with 2 distinct lobes of destruction. And as they approached the center, the point from which the blast wave had clearly emanated, the landscape became even more surreal. Here, there were no felled trees. Instead, a small, eerie forest of dead trunks stood starkly against the sky. They were stripped bare of all their branches and bark, scorched and sharpened to a point, standing like a collection of giant, skeletal telegraph poles. They had not been knocked over. They had been flash-fried and denuded by a force that had come directly from above. Kulik searched frantically. He and his men spent weeks, and then months on subsequent expeditions, scouring the epicenter. They surveyed, they dug, they drilled into the marshy soil and permafrost. They were searching for the one thing that had to be there, the impactor. A crater, a fragment, a single, solitary piece of meteorite. They found nothing. There was no crater. The ground at the very center of the most powerful impact event in modern history was spongy and swampy, but unbroken. There were no signs of a physical object having collided with the Earth. Exhaustive magnetic surveys failed to detect any large metallic mass buried below the surface. The chemical analysis of the soil and the drilling of peat bogs yielded microscopic silicate and magnetite spheres, some with high concentrations of nickel and iridium, elements common in extraterrestrial objects. But these were mere dust, tiny melted droplets that could have been formed by a body that vaporized high in the atmosphere. They were not the remnants of a solid object that had gouged a hole in the planet. Kulik was baffled, his entire scientific framework thrown into disarray. He had come seeking a meteorite and found only a ghost. The evidence pointed to a colossal aerial explosion, occurring at an altitude estimated to be between 5 and 10 kilometers above the ground. Something had detonated with the force of a hydrogen bomb. But that something had, for all intents and purposes, vanished. The official Soviet reports, based on Kulik's work, concluded that a comet, a loose conglomeration of ice and dust, had entered the atmosphere and exploded before reaching the ground, explaining the lack of a crater or large fragments. For many years, this became the most widely accepted scientific theory. A comet, being mostly frozen gases, would have vaporized completely in the heat of the blast, leaving only microscopic dust and the observed devastation. But the comet theory, while plausible, did not satisfy everyone. It failed to account for some of the event's more peculiar aspects. Eyewitnesses had described a solid, cylindrical object maneuvering in the sky, not the diffuse, fuzzy head of a typical comet. The trajectory was another problem. Comets typically have highly inclined orbits, but the Tunguska object appeared to have entered the atmosphere at a relatively shallow angle. And while a comet explosion would be bright, would it explain the nights of glowing skies across Europe, or the reports of significant magnetic storms that followed the event? The sheer strangeness of the evidence, or lack thereof, opened the door to more exotic and terrifying speculations. In the 1960s and 70s, as physics advanced, new theories emerged. Two physicists, Albert A. Jackson and Michael P. Ryan, proposed in 1973 that the event could have been caused by a microscopic black hole passing through the Earth. Such an object, weighing perhaps as much as an asteroid but compressed to a subatomic size, would have shot through the planet like a bullet through an apple. The blast wave would have been created by the acoustic and hydrodynamic shock of its passage through the atmosphere. It was an elegant theory that explained the lack of a crater and the immense energy release. It even provided a testable hypothesis. If a black hole had passed through the planet, it must have exited on the other side, creating a similar disturbance in the North Atlantic. No such corresponding event was ever detected, and the theory, while intellectually stimulating, was largely discarded. Another hypothesis from the realm of theoretical physics suggested a collision with a small piece of antimatter. The total annihilation of matter and antimatter would release a pure, incredible burst of energy, perfectly explaining the powerful airburst and the complete absence of any physical remnants. But antimatter is believed to be exceedingly rare in our universe, if it exists at all in a stable, microscopic form. The odds of a naturally occurring chunk of it happening to intersect Earth's orbit were considered infinitesimally small, with the mainstream scientific theories leaving so many questions unanswered. Other researchers began to look at the evidence from a different, more unsettling perspective. What if the object was not natural at all? In 1946, a Soviet science fiction writer named Alexander Kazantsev published a story called The Explosion. While visiting Hiroshima and seeing the devastation brought by the atomic bomb that flattened the city, the standing, scorched structures at the epicenter, he was struck by the eerie similarity to the descriptions of Tunguska. Kazantsev proposed a radical hypothesis. The Tunguska event was not a natural impact, but the explosion of an alien spacecraft's nuclear-powered engine. The idea was dismissed as fantasy by the scientific establishment, but it captured the public imagination and resonated deeply with the core strangeness of the event. It was a theory that, in its own way, fit the facts just as well, if not better, than the others. An intelligent craft, perhaps damaged and losing control, might have attempted to use its final moments to minimize damage. It could have deliberately detonated its power source at a high altitude to avoid a catastrophic ground impact. That would have left a far greater scar on the planet. This would explain the aerial nature of the blast, the lack of a crater, and the absence of fragments. It could even explain the butterfly-shaped pattern of destruction, perhaps caused by a directed or asymmetrical explosion as a failing ship vented energy. This hypothesis, once relegated to the fringe, began to attract more serious, if cautious, consideration from a handful of Russian scientists. They re-examined the eyewitness accounts. Multiple witnesses reported the object changing course or maneuvering. One account from the village of Preobrazhenka, far to the south, described the object as a fiery body that flew over the village, and from the south side, it turned to the north. Such a maneuver would be impossible for a passive meteorite or comet locked in a ballistic trajectory. Further analysis of soil samples from the epicenter, conducted by researchers like Dr. Andrei Kovatov, hinted at anomalies. Reports circulated of unusual isotopic ratios and trace elements not easily explained by a simple meteoritic origin. Some claim to have found fused quartz crystals with strange inscriptions, though these artifacts were never presented for widespread independent verification and remain deep in the realm of unsubstantiated rumor. Yet, the possibility lingered. Consider the event from the perspective of an advanced intelligence. If one were to test a weapon of immense power, where would one do it? The most logical choice would be a planet known to be inhabited by primitive life, but in a location so remote that the test would go largely unobserved and its evidence swallowed by the wilderness. The Siberian taiga of 1908 was, for all practical purposes, the perfect laboratory. An aerial detonation would demonstrate the weapon's power without leaving the messy, undeniable evidence of an impact crater, allowing for a degree of plausible deniability. The energy released would be studied from a safe distance, the atmospheric and seismic effects monitored, the biological impact on the flora and fauna observed over the following decades. Or perhaps it was not a test, but an accident. A scout ship, an interstellar probe, suffering a critical malfunction in its propulsion or power system, as it plummeted into the dense atmosphere of an uncharted world. Its automated systems, or its desperate crew, made a final choice: detonate high in the sky. It would be an act of self-destruction. Yes, but also a final, desperate act of quarantine, preventing the craft's unknown technologies and potentially hazardous materials from contaminating the planet's surface. The object seen in the sky was not a rock, but a vessel in its death throes. Its final moments a controlled, catastrophic explosion. This would explain the maneuvering, the intense energy, and the phantom-like disappearance. The most disturbing possibility combines the two. What if the Tunguska event was a defensive action? Some theorists have posited that the object was not what caused the explosion, but was rather the target. They point to fringe witness accounts that speak of not one, but two objects in the sky, of a smaller, faster object intercepting the larger one. In this scenario, the Tunguska object was a genuine threat to the planet. A meteoroid or comet on a collision course. And something, an unseen and unknown guardian, destroyed it. Was it a planetary defense system left behind by an ancient, long-vanished civilization? Or was it an active patrol, an intelligence that watches over our world and, on that June morning, intervened to save it from a catastrophe far greater than the one that occurred? If so, the 80 million fallen trees of Tunguska are not a monument to destruction, but the collateral damage of our salvation by an unknown and unknowable protector. Today, more than a century later, the Tunguska site remains a place of profound mystery. The forest has begun to reclaim the land. New trees grow where the old ones were scorched and felled. But the legacy of 1908 is written into the very biology of the region. Scientists studying the forest have discovered that the trees in the blast zone exhibit a period of abnormally accelerated growth in the years following the event. It is as if they were irradiated, their biological clocks thrown into chaos by an immense release of energy. More unsettling are the reports of significant genetic anomalies in the area's pine trees and even its insect populations. The energy that flattened the forest did not just apply physical force. It seems to have altered the fundamental building blocks of life itself. The radiation levels today are normal, suggesting that if it was a nuclear event, it was of a kind so clean and efficient that it left behind no lingering fallout. A technology far beyond our own in the 1940s, let alone what an alien race might possess. The mystery endures because the heart of the event is an absence. No crater, no craft, no identifiable fragments of the object that wielded the power of 1,000 suns. All that remains is the echoing silence of a flattened forest and the faint, unsettling whispers of what might have been. We are left staring at the ghostly imprint of an incomprehensible power. Science offers plausible, if incomplete, explanations. But the gaps in the data are where the true horror lies. Filled by possibilities that stretch the limits of our understanding of the universe and our place within it. The land itself still holds the scar. The young trees grow faster, the insects carry mutated genes, and the soil contains microscopic spheres of fused glass and metal from the sky. The evidence is all around, yet the central question remains unanswered. Hanging over the Siberian taiga like the eerie, glowing nights of 1908. What kind of force can topple a city-sized expanse of forest, vaporize its own source, and leave behind nothing but scorched earth and a terrifying new pattern written into the DNA of the survivors?